A millionaire pleaded with a poor single mother-to-be, "Pretend to be my wife for a few days." The reason left her speechless, but neither of them expected this charade to become a grand forbidden romance that would change their lives forever. An unexpected love story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment on where you're watching from. The rain hammered against the windows of the small apartment in Brooklyn when Sarah Johnson received the call that would change her life forever. At 28, with her brown hair tied up in a messy bun and wearing a faded pajama set, she struggled to find the strength for another day. Her 6-month baby bump felt like it weighed a ton as she dragged herself through the living room, where stacked cardboard boxes constantly reminded her of the cruel reality. In 2 weeks, she would be evicted. "Hello?" Her voice came out hoarse, tired from the tears she had shed the night before. "Is this Sarah Johnson?" The male voice on the other end sounded formal, almost robotic. "My name is David Thompson, and I represent the interests of Mr. Edward Sinclair. I would like to propose a meeting to discuss a professional opportunity." Sarah almost hung up right away. In the past few months, since Rodrigo had disappeared, leaving only a cowardly note about not being ready to be a father, she had learned to distrust anything that seemed too good to be true. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked, adjusting herself on the worn-out sofa she had bought at a thrift store 3 years earlier. "I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Mr. Sinclair is willing to offer a compensation of $500,000 for 3 months of work." The phone almost slipped from her hands. $500,000? This had to be a scam, or worse, something illegal. "Listen, I don't know what kind of—" "Miss Johnson, I can assure you that this is a legitimate proposal. Mr. Sinclair needs a temporary housekeeper to assist with family matters. Nothing more than that." 2 hours later, Sarah was in the back seat of a black BMW, watching the urban landscape of New York City gradually transform from the deteriorating buildings of downtown to the imposing mansions of the Upper East Side. Her hands trembled slightly. She didn't know if it was anxiety, low blood sugar, or simply fear of the unknown. The Sinclair mansion loomed like a European castle amidst the chaos of the city. Tall stone walls protected gardens that looked straight out of a decor magazine, with perfectly aligned red roses and marble fountains that softly gurgled. Sarah swallowed hard. She, who had grown up in Springfield in a 3-room house, had never imagined she would one day set foot in a place like this. David guided her through hallways adorned with tapestries that seemed to have centuries of history. The scent of polished wood and lavender lingered in the air, creating an atmosphere that was both welcoming and intimidating. Finally, they arrived at an office where Edward Sinclair awaited her. The man before her did not match anything she had imagined. Tall, around 6'1", Edward had slightly graying black hair at the temples and deep brown eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He wore an impeccable navy suit, but there was something in his posture that suggested exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too many responsibilities for too long. "Miss Johnson, thank you for accepting our invitation." He stood up, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Please, have a seat. Would you like something to drink? Water, juice?" "Water, please," Sarah replied, still trying to process where she was. The office was the size of her entire apartment, with shelves that reached from floor to ceiling, filled with books in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Edward poured water into a crystal glass that probably cost more than her rent. "I imagine you're curious about the proposal." "Curious is a mild word," Sarah admitted, accepting the glass. "When someone offers $500,000 for 3 months of work as a housekeeper, the first thing I think is, what's the catch?" For the first time since she arrived, Edward smiled genuinely. "Your honesty is refreshing. Most people would try to disguise their skepticism." "I don't have the energy to pretend," she replied, one hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "I'm 6 months pregnant, about to be evicted, and the father of my child decided it would be easier to just disappear than take responsibility. So if this is a scam, at least be creative. Edward watched her in silence for a moment, and Sarah had the impression that he was assessing something far beyond her professional qualifications. "It's not a scam, Sarah. Can I call you Sarah?" And seeing her nod, he continued, "My situation is complicated. I've been a widower for 2 years. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Thompson, is a traditional Spanish woman who firmly believes that a man my age should not remain alone." "And what does that have to do with me?" Edward took a deep breath, as if preparing to leap off a cliff. "She is threatening to withdraw financial support from the family business if I don't demonstrate that I'm moving on with my personal life. The company employs over 5,000 people, Sarah. I can't let my stubbornness to remain single jeopardize the livelihood of so many families." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "I still don't understand where I fit into this story. I need someone who agrees to pretend to be my wife for the next 3 months. Enough time for me to prove to Mrs. Thompson that I'm rebuilding my life and regain her trust in the business." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah blinked several times, making sure she had heard correctly. "You want me to pretend to be your wife, while I'm obviously pregnant with another man's child? The story would be that we met recently, and that I decided to take you and the baby as my own." Mrs. Thompson has a soft spot for romantic stories and noble gestures. Sarah abruptly stood up, which was a mistake considering her condition. A wave of dizziness hit her, and Edward immediately stepped closer to support her. "This is total madness," she murmured, feeling his strong hands steadying her. "You don't even know me. What if I'm a criminal? What if I steal your things? What if it works?" Edward gently interrupted, helping her sit down again. "Sarah, I've looked into your past. I know you have a degree in accounting, that you worked for 5 years at the same company until you were laid off due to budget cuts during your pregnancy. I know your parents died in an accident when you were 17, and since then, you've been supporting yourself. I know the father of your baby is a married lawyer who promised to leave his wife but disappeared when he found out about the pregnancy." Tears began to sting Sarah's eyes. "You had no right to investigate my life." "I did. Because I need to trust you as much as you need to trust me. The rules would be simple. Separate rooms, strictly professional relationship, and at the end of 3 months, each of us goes our own way. You would have top-notch medical care for the remainder of your pregnancy, a safe home for the baby to be born, and enough money to secure both your futures." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process everything. It was madness. It was risky. It was, what if your mother-in-law discovers the charade? "She won't find out. As long as we both play our parts properly. What if I develop feelings for you during this time?" The question slipped out before she could control herself. Edward looked genuinely surprised. "Sarah, I don't believe that's a real concern. We are both adults, capable of separating need from emotion." She opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Do you really believe that?" Edward turned his gaze to the window, where the rain had stopped and a timid ray of sunshine illuminated the gardens. "I need to believe. I have no choice." Sarah remained silent for long minutes, weighing the pros and cons. $500,000 would solve all her financial problems. Her baby would be born safely with the best medical care available. And then she would have resources to restart her life anywhere she chose. "Is there a contract?" she finally asked. Edward smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. "David?" The lawyer, who had been discreetly standing in the corner of the room, approached with a leather folder. "All the terms are specified here. Amounts, deadlines, responsibilities of both parties, and confidentiality clauses." Sarah flipped through the pages, her accounting experience helping her understand the legal language. Everything seemed to be in order. Absurdly in order for such an absurd situation. What if I change my mind? There is a termination clause. Either party can terminate the agreement with 7 days' notice, with proportional compensation. She looked at Edward again. "Why me? Why not hire a professional actress?" "Because Mrs. Thompson has a sixth sense for deceit. You are genuine, Sarah, and your situation makes the whole story more believable. A man who agrees to take on a pregnant woman demonstrates exactly the kind of noble character she admires. Sarah took a deep breath one last time before extending her hand to take the pen. 3 months, she said, more to herself than to him. 3 months, Edward confirmed. When she signed her name on the contract, Sarah Johnson had no idea she was signing much more than a business agreement. She was signing a sentence that would change not only her life, but also Edward's, and that of a Spanish matriarch eagerly awaiting to meet the woman who had captured her beloved son-in-law's heart. Outside, the sun finally conquered the clouds, bathing the gardens of the Sinclair mansion in a golden light that seemed to promise new beginnings. The room Sarah received in the Sinclair mansion was larger than her entire old apartment. The walls were painted in a soft ivory hue, adorned with paintings depicting Mediterranean landscapes. A king-size bed with Egyptian linen sheets occupied the center of the space, while large windows with silk curtains offered a view of the inner gardens. But despite all the luxury, Sarah felt like an intruder in a museum. "I hope you're comfortable." Edward appeared at the door, wearing dress pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. It was her first morning in the mansion, and she was still trying to get used to the idea of waking up in such a different place from her world. "It's impressive," Sarah replied, adjusting the navy blue dress she had hastily bought the day before. Edward had insisted on taking her shopping for appropriate clothes for the coming weeks, an experience that left her feeling both grateful and uncomfortable. "Mrs. Thompson will arrive in 2 hours for Sunday lunch." "It's a tradition she never breaks." Edward entered the room, keeping a respectful distance. "She is intense, but she has a good heart." Sarah felt the nerves tighten in her stomach. What if she doesn't believe our story? What if she realizes we're pretending? "Breathe, Sarah." Edward stepped closer, noticing she had begun to hyperventilate. "Let's go over everything again. How did we meet?" "In a cafe in the Upper West Side 3 months ago," she recited, as they had rehearsed. "You spilled coffee on my blouse by accident and insisted on paying for the dry cleaning. And when did we start dating?" 2 weeks later. You called me to apologize again and invited me to dinner. And why did I decide to take you and the baby on?" Sarah hesitated. This part of the story always made her feel uncomfortable, especially because Edward had crafted it with such conviction that sometimes she almost believed it herself. "Because you said you had never met someone so strong and determined. That the fact I was fighting alone for giving my son a dignified life showed exactly the kind of character you admired." Edward nodded, but his eyes seemed distant. "Perfect, and remember, we call each other love when we're in her presence. Affectionate gestures are important, but keep everything subtle." At exactly 11 o'clock, a newer black BMW than Edward's stopped in front of the mansion. Sarah watched from the living room window as an elegant woman in her 70s emerged from the vehicle. Mrs. Thompson had a majestic bearing, perfectly styled grey hair in a low bun, and wore a burgundy silk suit that probably cost more than Sarah's annual salary when she was still working. "She's intimidating," Sarah murmured as Edward joined her at the window. "Mrs. Thompson built a textile empire alongside my father-in-law when they arrived from Spain, with nothing but 2 suitcases and a dream. She has reasons to be intimidating." Edward placed a gentle hand on Sarah's back. "But she also lost her only daughter 8 years ago. Behind all that strength, there's a woman who just wants to see her family happy again." The front door swung open, and Mrs. Thompson entered like an elegant whirlwind, followed by 2 maids carrying bags that exuded delicious aromas of spices. "Edward, my boy," she exclaimed, embracing her son-in-law with genuine affection. She spoke English with a distinct Spanish accent that added music to her words. "Where is this girl you've told me so much about?" Sarah took a deep breath and descended the stairs, one hand resting on the mahogany railing for balance. Mrs. Thompson turned and studied her from head to toe with eyes that seemed to be X-rays. "So this is Sarah," she finally said in perfect English but laden with emotion. "Oh my, what a beautiful girl." To Sarah's surprise, the woman stepped closer and enveloped her in a warm embrace that smelled of French perfume and cinnamon. "Mrs. Thompson, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," Sarah managed to say when she was released from the hug. "Please, call me Abuela Esperanza. After all, I'll be a great-grandmother very soon, won't I?" The woman's eyes sparkled as they looked at Sarah's belly. "May I?" Sarah nodded nervously as Mrs. Thompson placed her hands on her belly with surprising gentleness. "It's a strong boy," she declared with conviction. "I can feel the kicks. And you, my girl, are radiant. Is Edward taking good care of you both?" "Very well, Abuela," Sarah replied, surprised at how naturally the nickname rolled off her tongue. "He doesn't let me do anything alone." Edward stepped closer and wrapped an arm around Sarah's waist, the gesture feeling more natural than either of them expected. "Sarah is stubborn," he said with a smile that seemed genuine. "Yesterday, I found her trying to organize the library. 6 months pregnant and wanting to move heavy books. Typical of a pregnant woman." Mrs. Thompson laughed, tapping Edward's arm. "You must have patience, my boy. Pregnant women get restless when they feel useless." Lunch was served in the main dining room, an imposing space with a mahogany table that easily accommodated 12 people. Mrs. Thompson had brought Valencian paella prepared by her personal chef, along with Spanish tortillas and non-alcoholic sangria, especially for Sarah. "Tell me about your family." "Dear," Mrs. Thompson said as she served Sarah with maternal generosity. "Edward told me you lost your parents at a young age." Sarah swallowed hard. Talking about her parents was always difficult, but doing so as part of an elaborate lie made everything even more complicated. "They died in a car accident when I was 17, she replied honestly. "My father was an accountant at a small firm, my mother a primary school teacher. Simple people, but they always taught me to value dignity and honest work." Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my girl, losing your parents so young. It must have been terrible." "It was hard," Sarah admitted, feeling Edward gently squeeze her hand under the table. "But they taught me to be strong. And now," she looked at Edward, "I have a new family." "Yes, you are right," Mrs. Thompson smiled, drying her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. "And this baby will have grandparents who will love him very much." During dessert, homemade flan that melted in the mouth, Mrs. Thompson began to ask more specific questions about their relationship. "How did you know Edward was the right man for you?" She asked, serving more flan to Sarah despite her protests. Sarah looked at Edward, who nodded encouragingly. They had rehearsed this answer, but now, sitting there surrounded by such luxury and genuine affection, the words felt inadequate. "From our first meeting, I realized Edward was different," she began, but then something changed in her voice. "He could have simply apologized for the spilled coffee and moved on. But Edward genuinely cared about solving the problem. And when he learned about my situation," she paused, looking directly into his eyes, "he never judged me. He never made me feel like a burden." Edward watched her with an intensity that made Sarah's heart race. "And you, my boy?" Mrs. Thompson turned to Edward. "What made you fall in love with Sarah?" Edward took a moment to respond, his eyes still fixed on Sarah. "Her strength," he finally said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Sarah has faced situations that would break many people, but she never gave up. She never played the victim. And when I look at her," he paused, as if the next word surprised him, "I see the kind of woman and mother any man would be honored to have by his side." The silence that followed was thick with emotions. Neither of them was prepared to confront. Mrs. Thompson watched them with a knowing smile. "True love is always recognized," she murmured softly. "You both radiate happiness when you look at each other." After lunch, Mrs. Thompson insisted on. Sarah showed Edward the nursery she had prepared for the baby in her own mansion. "For when you come to visit," she explained, leading Edward through hallways decorated with imported tiles from Andalusia. The room was a dream in pastel shades, with a hand-carved wooden crib and mobiles playing lullabies. There were tiny clothes carefully organized in an antique dresser, and the walls were adorned with illustrations of classic fairy tales. "Mrs. Thompson, this is—" Sarah began, but emotion choked her voice. "Do you like it?" the older woman asked anxiously. "I know it might be premature, but when Edward told me about the baby, I couldn't help myself. It's been so long since I've had a baby in the family." Sarah turned to embrace Mrs. Thompson, tears finally escaping. They were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude mixed with guilt. This woman was offering unconditional love based on a lie. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you for accepting me so easily into your family." "My girl," Mrs. Thompson said, pulling Sarah back to look into her eyes, "a family is not defined just by blood. It is defined by love, by choice, by commitment. Edward chose you and your baby. That makes you my family too." When they returned to the main room, they found Edward on the phone, speaking in a low but tense voice with someone. "I don't care how much he's offering. The answer is no, because some things are not for sale, Roberto." He abruptly hung up upon seeing the women approaching, but not before Sarah noticed the concern in his eyes. "Is everything okay, my boy?" Mrs. Thompson asked, always attentive. "Just business, Grandma. Nothing that can't be resolved." Edward forced a smile, but Sarah noticed the tension in his shoulders. Mrs. Thompson stayed until the beginning of the evening, sharing stories from Spain and teaching Sarah some basic Spanish words. When she finally said goodbye, she hugged both of them with tears in her eyes. "I haven't seen Edward this happy in a long time," she whispered to Sarah. "Thank you for bringing the light back to his eyes." After Mrs. Thompson left, Edward and Sarah were alone in the room, the weight of the day finally settling upon them. "She's amazing," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "And she adored you," Edward replied, loosening his tie. "More than I expected, to be honest." "Edward," Sarah hesitated. "That call earlier? Was something wrong?" He studied her for a moment, as if weighing how much to share. "Roberto Mendes, an old business acquaintance. He's been making aggressive offers to buy my share of the company." "And is that bad?" "Depending on the circumstances. It could be very bad." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. For the first time, she began to wonder if she had gotten herself into something much more complicated than she had imagined. That night, lying in her luxurious bed, Sarah stared at the ceiling and replayed every moment of the day. Mrs. Thompson's kindness, the ease with which she and Edward had interacted, the way he had looked at her when he spoke about strength. 3 months, she reminded herself. It was just a job for 3 months. But as she fell asleep, she couldn't forget the feeling of Edward's hands in hers, nor how her heart had raced when he called her strong. Perhaps 3 months were more dangerous than she had imagined. The following week brought an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Sarah woke up every morning, finding Edward already up, having coffee on the balcony overlooking the inner gardens. He always greeted her with a reserved smile and asked how she had slept, simple gestures that began to mean more than either of them was willing to admit. "Good morning," Edward said on Thursday, getting up to pull a chair out for her. "How are you two today?" Sarah noticed that he always referred to her and the baby as a unit, never just, "How are you?" Such small details made her question whether Edward was really pretending, or if there was something more genuine in his consideration. "Restless," she admitted, accepting the fresh orange juice he had prepared for her. "I think the baby inherited my anxiety." "Anxiety about what?" Sarah hesitated. The truth was, she was anxious about many things. About the medical appointment they had that afternoon, about how she was getting too comfortable with that lifestyle, about how the scent of Edward's cologne had begun to feel comforting instead of strange. About today's appointment, she chose the safest answer. "It's the morphology ultrasound. We'll find out the baby's gender." Edward nearly choked on his coffee. "We are? You said it was part of the agreement to attend important medical appointments." "To keep up appearances," Sarah studied him carefully. "Unless you've changed your mind." "No, of course not," he replied quickly, but she noticed his hands trembling slightly as he set the cup back down. "It's just that, well, it will be the first time I see the baby." The vulnerability in his voice surprised Sarah. During the 2 weeks they had lived in the same house, Edward had always been composed, polite, maintaining a perfect professional distance. But now, talking about seeing the baby for the first time, he seemed almost nervous. "Edward, you don't have to go if you don't want to. I can tell the doctor you had an important meeting." "No," he interrupted her with a firmness that surprised her. "I want to go. I need to go. If we are going to convince everyone that we are a real couple, I need to meet. I need to know about the baby." 3 hours later, they were sitting in the waiting room of the most expensive clinic in New York City. Edward was wearing a sharp grey suit, but his hands were visibly tense as he flipped through a magazine without really reading it. Sarah wore a light green dress that accentuated her eyes, carefully chosen by Edward during their shopping session. "Last week, Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair?" The nurse called, and Sarah felt a strange shiver hearing her name linked to Edward's that way. Dr. Richard Johnson was a middle-aged man with gentle manners and an impeccable reputation. When Edward introduced himself as Sarah's husband, the doctor greeted him with the deference reserved for the very wealthy. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sinclair. Sarah told me that you have taken on the fatherhood of this child. It's a very noble gesture." Edward maintained his composure, but Sarah noticed he swallowed hard before responding. "Sarah and the baby are my family now, Doctor. That's all that matters." Lying on the examination table, with the cold gel on her belly, Sarah watched Edward position himself next to the chair, his eyes fixed on the ultrasound screen. When the blurry image of the baby appeared, followed by the strong and rhythmic heartbeat filling the room, she saw something change in his expression. "My God!" Edward whispered, unaware that he had spoken aloud. "He's a very active boy," Dr. Johnson commented, moving the transducer to different angles. "Look how he's moving his little arms. And here," he paused, adjusting the image, "we can clearly see that it's a boy." "A boy," Sarah repeated, tears streaming down her cheeks as she gazed at the screen. Throughout those months, even knowing she carried a life inside her, seeing the baby so clearly defined on the screen made everything feel infinitely more real. Edward remained silent, but when Sarah looked at him, she saw that his eyes were also moist. "Would you like some pictures?" The doctor asked. "Yes, please," Edward replied before Sarah could speak, his voice slightly hoarse. After the appointment, they drove back home in silence. Edward carefully held the envelope with the ultrasound pictures, as if carrying something precious and fragile. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, when they stopped at a traffic light. Edward began, then stopped, clearly struggling with his words. "I didn't expect it to be so real." "What?" "Seeing him, hearing the heartbeat, knowing that in 3 months he will be here, breathing, crying, needing care." Edward ran a hand through his hair. "I know he's not my biological son, Sarah, but in that moment, looking at the screen..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Sarah understood perfectly because she felt the same way. That night, Mrs. Thompson showed up unannounced, something that, according to Edward, was completely typical of her. She found them in the living room, Sarah with her feet resting on Edward's lap, while he massaged her swollen ankles, the ultrasound pictures spread out on the coffee table. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed upon seeing the images. "Is that the baby? Let me see." Edward immediately got up to fetch the pictures, and Sarah noticed how he handled them with reverent care. "It's a boy, Grandma," he said, handing the images to Mrs. Thompson with a genuine smile. "A great-grandson," Mrs. Thompson shouted, hugging the pictures to her chest before sitting down next to Sarah and wrapping her in a tight embrace. "Oh, my girl, what a great blessing. He was very active during the exam," Sarah laughed, still moved by Mrs. Thompson's reaction. "The doctor said that's a good sign." "Of course it is. The Sinclairs have always been fighters," Mrs. Thompson declared proudly, studying each photo in detail. "Look, Edward, he has your strong chin." Edward leaned in to see where Mrs. Thompson was pointing. "You think?" "Absolutely. And look at this profile. Definitely a Sinclair." Sarah watched the interaction between mother-in-law and son-in-law, touched by how both were reacting to the pictures. Mrs. Thompson spoke as if the baby were already officially part of the family. And Edward looked at the images as if he were seeing his own son. "We need to start thinking about names," Mrs. Thompson declared suddenly. "Have you thought of any?" Sarah and Edward exchanged glances. This was a conversation they hadn't had yet. "Well," Sarah began hesitantly, "I've always liked the name Michael." "Michael!" Mrs. Thompson clapped her hands. "What a beautiful name. Michael Sinclair? It sounds perfect." "Michael Sinclair," Edward repeated slowly, as if testing how the name sounded. "I like it." "Then it's decided," Mrs. Thompson declared authoritatively. "Michael will be the baby's name. And now let's talk about the crib. It needs to be set up soon because babies sometimes decide to arrive early." The next 2 hours were spent planning. Details for Michael's arrival. Mrs. Thompson had brought catalogues of baby furniture and fabric samples, insisting that the nursery in the Sinclair mansion should be fit for a prince. Edward actively participated in the conversation, offering opinions on colors and furniture with an enthusiasm that surprised Sarah. For someone who was supposedly just pretending to be a father, he showed a very genuine interest in every detail. "And the baby shower?" Mrs. Thompson asked as it was getting close to midnight. "We need to organize a celebration to announce Michael to the whole family." Sarah felt panic rise in her throat. "A party? But Grandma, I don't know your family. Wouldn't that be strange?" "Nonsense." Mrs. Thompson waved her hand dismissively at the concerns. "It's the perfect way to officially introduce you as the new Mrs. Sinclair, and Michael deserves to be celebrated." Edward noticed Sarah's anxiety and gently intervened. "Grandma, maybe we should wait a little longer." Sarah is still adjusting to all of this. "Exactly for that reason," Mrs. Thompson insisted. "The sooner she meets the whole family, the sooner she'll feel at home. It's already decided. We'll have the party next Saturday." After Mrs. Thompson left, Sarah stayed in the living room, nervously organizing and reorganizing the ultrasound pictures. "Are you worried about the party?" Edward asked, sitting down next to her on the couch. "Terrified would be a more appropriate word," she admitted. "Edward, I've known you for 2 weeks. How am I supposed to convince a room full of your relatives that we are a couple?" Marina laughed humorlessly. "Edward, today at the doctor's office when you saw Michael on the screen, that reaction wasn't fake. And the way you were looking at the pictures, talking about names," she stared directly at him. "You're starting to really care about that baby." Edward fell silent for a long moment, his hands nervously fiddling with the loosened tie. "And if I am?" he finally asked, his voice low. "Would that be a problem?" The question hung between them, laden with implications neither was prepared to face. "I don't know," Marina replied honestly. "The agreement was to keep everything professional." "The agreement was made before we saw Michael moving his little arms on the screen," Edward gently interrupted her. "Before hearing his heart beating. Before knowing he would be Michael Thompson." "Edward, Marina, I'm not suggesting we change the terms of our agreement. But I also can't pretend that today hasn't changed something for me. That baby," he paused, searching for the right words, "may not be mine biologically, but for 3 months I'm going to be the father figure in his life. And I take that responsibility seriously." Marina felt tears burning her eyes. "And then, when the 3 months are over and we go our separate ways, what happens to Michael when he loses the only father he's known?" The question hit Edward like a punch to the gut. For the first time since they made the agreement, he considered the long-term implications for the baby. He began, but was interrupted by the ringing phone. Edward answered irritably. "Hello?" Marina watched his expression change drastically as he listened to the person on the other end. "When?" he asked, his voice tense. "How much are they offering?" "I see. No, don't do anything until tomorrow. I need to think." He hung up and stood still for a moment, his face pale. "What was that?" Marina asked, alarmed. "Robert Anderson just made a formal offer to buy my share of the company. An offer the board will seriously consider." Edward got up and started pacing back and forth. "And there's more. He found out about you, about our arrangement." Marina's blood ran cold. "How?" "I don't know. But he suggested that if our situation became public, it could severely affect my credibility in business. One thing is to accept a pregnant wife. Another is to discover that the marriage is a sham. Marina slowly stood up, one hand protectively over her belly. Is he blackmailing us? Not directly yet, but the threat was implied in the conversation. They looked at each other in silence, both understanding that the game had completely changed. What had started as a simple agreement now involved blackmail, a multi-million-dollar company, and a baby they had both begun to love. What do we do now? Marina asked. Edward looked at the pictures of Michael spread out on the table, then back at Marina. Now, he said determinedly, we protect our family, by any means necessary. The word family echoed between them, and Marina realized that at some point during those 2 weeks it had stopped sounding like a lie. The party Saturday arrived like a golden hurricane. Marina woke up at 6 in the morning with Grandma ringing the doorbell insistently, followed by a team of decorators, florists, and chefs who transformed the Thompson mansion into a setting worthy of a luxury magazine. Arrangements of white and blue hydrangeas to celebrate little Michael filled every room, while uniformed waiters circulated testing Italian appetizers. "Wake up, my girl!" Grandma burst into Marina's room, carrying several designer bags. "Today you will meet the whole family, and you need to look perfect." Marina, still in her nightgown, nervously watched as Grandma dumped dresses worth more than her old annual salary onto the bed. "Grandma, this is too much," she started, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. Edward entered unceremoniously, already dressed in a navy suit that accentuated his brown eyes. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Marina in her nightgown, blushed slightly, and looked away. "Sorry, Grandma, you said you needed to talk to me about the guest list." "Yes." Grandma turned to him, completely oblivious to the awkwardness of the moment. "I decided to invite the Andersons as well. Robert and Carol will be here this afternoon." Edward's face instantly paled. "You did what?" Marina felt her stomach churn. Robert Anderson, the man who had discovered their agreement and was making veiled threats. "It's important to maintain family relationships, Edward," Grandma said authoritatively. Robert can be tough in business, but Carol has been my friend for 40 years. And besides, it will be a good opportunity to show how happy and established you are." Edward and Marina exchanged glances, both realizing that the party had become much more dangerous than they had imagined. "Grandma," Edward tried to keep his voice calm, "maybe this isn't the best time to—" "Nonsense!" Grandma cut him off. "Robert needs to see that you have a solid family now, that you are no longer available for his business maneuvers." She turned to Marina. "And you, my girl, need to meet all the important players in Edward's life." 2 hours later, Marina looked at herself in the main bathroom mirror, wearing a royal blue silk dress that fit her pregnant body perfectly. Edward had personally chosen the piece. "It accentuates your eyes," he had said, with an intensity that made her heart race. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Marina, can I come in?" Edward entered carrying a small, elegant jewelry box. "I thought you might want to wear this today." Inside the box was a pearl necklace with a diamond clasp that clearly was a family heirloom. "Edward, I can't," she began, but he gently interrupted her. "It belonged to my wife," he said softly, taking the necklace out of the box. "Elizabeth always said that pearls were the perfect accessory for any important occasion." Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. "Are you sure? Wouldn't it be strange?" Edward positioned himself behind her, his hands gentle as he placed the necklace around her neck. His fingers brushed against Sarah's nape, sending shivers down her spine. "Elizabeth would be happy to know that her jewelry is being worn by someone who is part of the family," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "And you are part of it, Sarah. For all intents and purposes, you are a Thompson now." The moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. The first guests had arrived. The party was in full swing when Robert Anderson made his grand entrance. Tall, artificially tanned and wearing a suit that screamed new money, He greeted Edward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Edward, my old friend," Robert said, giving Edward unnecessary backpats. "And this must be the famous Sarah." Robert kissed Sarah's hand with an uncomfortable delay, his dark eyes studying her as if she were merchandise being appraised. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Anderson," Sarah managed to say, trying not to show how much he unsettled her. "The pleasure is all mine," Robert replied, still holding her hand. "Edward has always had an eye for beauty, and how lucky you are to find a man willing to take on—" He left the sentence hanging, looking significantly at Sarah's belly. Edward positioned himself protectively between them. "Sarah and Michael are my family, Robert. I hope that is clear." Of course," Robert laughed, but his eyes remained cold. "It's admirable, really. Not every man would have such generosity." Carol Anderson, Robert's wife, was an elegant woman in her 50s who clearly tried to look younger. She embraced Sarah with genuine kindness. "Darling, you look radiant, and Edward seems like a different man. It's been a while since I've seen him so animated." For the next hour, Sarah was introduced to a succession of uncles, cousins, and family friends. They were all kind and welcoming, especially when they learned about Michael. The older women insisted on touching her belly and giving advice about motherhood, while the men greeted Edward as if he had accomplished some heroic feat. "How do you feel?" Grandma asked when she found Sarah alone for a moment on the porch. "Honestly, overwhelmed," Sarah admitted. "Your family is wonderful, but there are so many people, so many stories to remember." "Don't worry, my dear. In time it all becomes natural." Grandma held Sarah's hands affectionately. "You know what? Seeing you today, seeing how Edward looks at you, how you take care of each other, it reminds me of my husband and me when we were young." Sarah felt a pang of guilt. "Grandma, true love is rare, Sarah. When it appears, we must protect it with everything we have." Before Sarah could respond, Edward appeared on the porch, clearly agitated. "Sarah, you need to come with me," he said urgently. "Now," Grandma frowned. "What's wrong, Edward?" "Nothing to worry about, Grandma. I just need to show something to Sarah." Edward quickly led Sarah through the party to his private office, closing the door behind them. "What happened?" Sarah asked, alarmed by Edward's tense expression. "Robert managed to get some journalists to come to the party. He's trying to create a situation where you are forced to give interviews about our relationship." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Interviews? He wants you to be questioned about intimate details of our relationship, hoping you'll make some mistake that exposes our charade." Edward began to pace back and forth. "There's a reporter from the most influential social magazine in New York City out there, along with a photographer." "Oh my God!" Sarah sat heavily in the chair behind the desk. "What do we do?" "We have two options." Edward stopped in front of her. "Either we go out the back door and make up an excuse about you feeling unwell, or Edward hesitated, clearly struggling with something, "or we give them exactly what they want to see. A loving couple with nothing to hide." "Edward, I don't know if I can—" "Sarah," he knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Remember when you asked what would happen after the 3 months, when our agreement ended?" She nodded, unable to speak. "I've been thinking about it every day since we saw Michael on the ultrasound screen. And the truth is," he took a deep breath, "I'm not sure I want it to end." Sarah's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this agreement has become something very different from what we planned. I'm saying that when I look at you, when I think about Michael, when I imagine waking up tomorrow without you two here—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Sarah, I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you. With both of you." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "Edward, I know it's complicated. I know it wasn't part of the agreement. But if there's a chance, even a small one, that you feel something similar—" A loud knock on the door interrupted them. "Edward," Robert's voice echoed from the hallway. "The reporter from Harper's Bazaar wants some photos of the happy couple." Edward and Sarah looked at each other, both knowing they had reached the moment of truth. "Sarah," Edward whispered, "whatever your answer about our future, I need to know now. Do you trust me enough to face this together?" Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing vulnerability, fear, hope, and something that felt very much like true love. "Yes," she whispered back. "I trust you." Edward stood up and helped her to her feet. "Then let's show them exactly what a loving couple looks like." They opened the office door to find Robert waiting with a predatory smile, accompanied by a well-dressed man with an expensive camera. "Ah, there you are!" Robert exclaimed falsely. "Sarah, this is Marcelo Ribeiro from Harper's Bazaar. He is doing a piece on the most influential couples in New York City." Marcelo approached with professional interest. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, it's a pleasure to meet you. May I ask a few questions about how you met? Our readers love true love stories." Sarah felt Edward gently squeeze her hand, and suddenly all the words came naturally. "Of course," she said with a genuine smile. "We would love to share our story." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Robert frown, clearly frustrated that he hadn't managed to provoke the panic he expected. The interview lasted 20 minutes, during which Sarah and Edward answered questions about their first meeting, Edward's decision to adopt Michael, and their plans for the future. Their answers flowed so naturally that at several moments Sarah completely forgot they were pretending. When Marcelo finally put away his recorder, he seemed genuinely touched. "You are an inspiring couple," he said sincerely. "It's rare to see such genuine love these days. This piece will be beautiful." After the journalist left, Robert approached them with an expression that mixed frustration and something resembling respect. "Impressive performance," he said quietly, just for them to hear. "You almost convinced me." "It wasn't a performance, Robert," Edward replied calmly. "And if you try to threaten my family again, you will discover what I am capable of when truly motivated." Robert studied Edward for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Message received, my friend. Message received." He walked away, leaving Edward and Sarah alone amidst the party that continued to buzz around them. "Do you think it worked?" Sarah asked. "I think Robert just realized we are no longer the easy opponents he thought we were," Edward replied, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "And about what you said in the office." "Every word was true," he gently interrupted her. "And when this party is over, when we are alone, I hope you will tell me what you are thinking about all of this." Sarah nodded, unable to speak, because she knew that when the time came, she would have to admit that she too had fallen in love with the man who reverently touched Michael in the ultrasound photos, who carefully chose his clothes with loving care, who instinctively protected her from men like Robert Anderson. She had fallen for the man who had turned a business agreement into something that was starting to look very much like a fairy tale. But fairy tales, Sarah reminded herself as she watched Edward being greeted by the guests, do not always have happy endings, especially when they are built on lies that are about to become too dangerous to sustain. The week following the party brought a deceptive calm that left Sarah constantly on edge. The piece in Harper's Bazaar had been published with beautiful photos of the couple and a romantic narrative that painted Edward as a modern hero. But along with the positive exposure came curious glances, comments on social media, and worse yet, the resurgence of Ryan Smith. Sarah was organizing the baby clothes in the room that Edward had prepared when Rosa, the housekeeper, appeared at the door with a worried expression. "Sorry to bother you, Mrs. Thompson, but there's a man at the door asking to speak with you. He says it's personal." Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew exactly who it was before Rosa even pronounced the name. "Ryan Smith? He insists it's urgent." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling Michael stir restlessly inside her, as if the baby could sense her anxiety. "Where is Mr. Edward?" "In a meeting at the office. He won't be back before 6. Sarah took a deep breath. She had managed to avoid Ryan for weeks, but she knew this confrontation was inevitable. "Tell him to come to the living room. And Rosa, please stay nearby." 10 minutes later, Sarah descended the stairs and found Ryan Smith pacing nervously in the main room. At 35, he was still objectively attractive. Tall, with well-groomed blonde hair, an expensive suit that didn't completely hide the beer belly he had started to develop. But seeing him there, in Edward's house, made Sarah realize how drastically her perception of him had changed. "Sarah," he turned upon hearing her, relief evident on his face. "Thank God, I need to talk to you." "Hello, Ryan." She kept her voice neutral, one hand instinctively protecting her belly. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" He laughed incredulously. "Sarah, you completely disappeared. Changed your phone, moved out of the apartment, don't respond to emails. I had to hire a private investigator to find out where you were." "You hired a private investigator?" Sarah's voice rose an octave. "Ryan, you have no right to—" "I have every right," he interrupted, stepping closer. "That's my child you're carrying." "Your child?" Sarah instinctively recoiled. "Ryan, you left a note saying you weren't ready to be a father and disappeared for months. Now you show up here talking about rights?" "I panicked, okay? Finding out I would be a father shocked me. But I've had time to think, to get used to the idea." He gestured around the opulent room. "And I certainly didn't expect to find you living in a mansion, pretending to be Edward Thompson's perfect wife." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" Ryan smiled with cruel satisfaction. "Did you really think no one would find out?" "Sarah, I'm a lawyer. Investigating is my profession. I know exactly when you two got married. I know there's no civil registry of a union. I know you were about to be evicted when you came to live here. Ryan—" Sarah tried to keep calm, but her voice trembled. "The question is, how much is Thompson paying you to pretend to be the perfect wife? And more importantly, how much do you want to return my child?" The fury that overtook Sarah was so intense that she felt Michael kick violently, as if the baby shared her emotions. Indignation. "Return, return," she shouted, approaching Ryan with fiery eyes. "Michael is not an object, Ryan, and you lost any right to him when you decided that being a father was too inconvenient for your life. Legally, I am still the biological father. And when this farce comes to light publicly, and it will, I will have an excellent chance of gaining custody. After all, what judge is going to give a child to a mother who sleeps with rich men?" The slap that Sarah delivered to Ryan echoed through the room like a gunshot. He recoiled, surprised, hand on his reddened face. "Get out of my house," she said, in a dangerously low voice. "Now, your house?" Ryan laughed bitterly. "Sarah, do you really believe that? Do you think when this lie explodes, Sinclair will keep you here? Men like him don't take women like you permanently. We are from the same social class, you and I. He is having fun, but when he gets tired—" "Get out!" Edward's voice echoed through the room, with an authority that made both turn immediately. He stood at the entrance, still wearing a business suit, but with an expression that Sarah had never seen before. Cold, dangerous, absolutely relentless. "Mr. Sinclair," Ryan tried to regain his composure. "Good to see you. We can talk like civilized men about this situation." Edward slowly walked to position himself between Ryan and Sarah, each step deliberate and threatening. "The only thing we are going to discuss is how you are going to leave my property without me having to call security to remove you physically. Listen, Sinclair, I know you have an arrangement, but that baby is my biological son. That baby," Edward interrupted with a frosty voice, "is my son in every way that matters. And if you try to use any information you think you have to harm Sarah or Michael, you will find out that I can be much more dangerous than any private investigator you have hired." Ryan tried to maintain bravado, but Sarah could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Edward Sinclair in protective mode was genuinely intimidating. "You can't threaten me. I have legal rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Edward said calmly. "And I suggest you exercise that right. Because if this conversation continues, I will have to explain to my legal department how a lawyer is trying to blackmail my family. And my legal department is very, very efficient." The silence that followed was tense. Ryan looked from Edward to Sarah, clearly weighing his options. "This isn't over," he finally said. "Sarah, when you get tired of being a rich man's toy, come find me. We can still resolve this civilly." Edward stepped toward Ryan, who immediately backed away. "Rose!" Edward called. "Please escort Mr. Smith to the exit and instruct security that he is not to return to this property." After Ryan left, Edward turned to Sarah, who had collapsed into an armchair, visibly trembling. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, kneeling beside her. "He knows, Edward," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He found out about our arrangement, and if he makes this public, then we will deal with it." Edward took her hands, noticing how cold they were. "Sarah, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing a fierce determination there. "Ryan Smith is a coward and an opportunist. Men like him make noise when they feel cornered, but rarely have the courage for real actions. But he is right about one thing," Sarah said in a broken voice. "Legally, he is Michael's father. If he files for custody, then we will make sure he has no grounds for that." Edward interrupted her firmly. "How?" Edward was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with something important. "Marry me," he finally said. "For real this time?" Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Marry me, Sarah. A legal, registered marriage that gives Michael my name officially, and you all the rights of a Sinclair wife." "Edward, you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life." He stood up and began to pace. "Think, Sarah. A real marriage would make it much harder for Ryan to legally question paternity. And as for our current situation, well, it wouldn't be a farce anymore, would it?" Sarah tried to process what she was hearing. "But you said you fell in love with me. A marriage for convenience isn't exactly who said it would be for convenience." Edward stopped in front of her. "Sarah, I love you. I love Michael. I love how our home has changed since you both arrived. I love waking up knowing you are here. I love planning the future, thinking about a family." "Edward, I know it's a lot to process. I know it started as a business arrangement, but it has grown into something much bigger, hasn't it? For you too?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to separate her genuine feelings from the fear and confusion of the moment. "Yes," she finally whispered. "I have fallen in love with you too. But Edward, marrying as a way to solve legal problems. It wouldn't be to solve legal problems." He knelt again, taking her hands. "It would be because we want to build a life together. The timing may be complicated, the circumstances may be unusual, but the feelings are real." Sarah opened her eyes to find Edward looking at her with a vulnerability that made her heart tighten. "And what if it doesn't work? What if we find out that what we feel is just an illusion created by the situation we are in? And what if it does work?" He countered. "What if we find out we found exactly what we both needed at the moment we needed it most?" Before Sarah could respond, Rose appeared at the door with an urgent expression. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Thompson is arriving. And she brought some people." Edward frowned. "Which people?" "I didn't recognize them, sir." "But they seem important." And Mrs. Thompson was animated. Edward and Sarah exchanged glances, both knowing that more complications were on the way. "Should we decide this later?" Edward asked quietly. Sarah nodded, but as they stood to greet Mrs. Thompson and her mysterious visitors, she couldn't stop thinking about his proposal. To truly marry Edward Sinclair, to turn her charade into reality, to give Michael a legitimate family and herself a chance at happiness she had never dared to dream of. But as she walked toward the door to greet Mrs. Thompson, a small voice in her mind whispered that it might be too good to be true. And in Sarah's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were just that. The doorbell rang, and Sarah took a deep breath, preparing for whatever new surprise fate had decided to throw her way. Michael kicked hard, as if he were preparing for battle too. "Let's find out what we're made of," Edward murmured beside her, offering his arm. Sarah accepted it, knowing that whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. For now, that would have to be enough. Mrs. Thompson entered the mansion like a general commanding troops, followed by 3 people Sarah didn't recognize: an elderly man in a sharp suit with a lawyer's demeanor, an elegant middle-aged woman, and surprisingly, a young woman about 25 with dark hair and eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Edward, Sarah!" Mrs. Thompson exclaimed, but there was something different in her voice, a mix of excitement and nervousness that immediately put them both on alert. "I have something very important to tell you." Edward stepped forward, instinctively positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. "Grandma, what's going on? Who are these people?" The elderly man stepped forward, extending a formal hand. "Mr. Sinclair, my name is Dr. Alfonso Mendez, attorney for the Delgado family for over 40 years. And these are Carol Ruiz," he gestured to the elegant woman, "and her daughter, Soledad." Sarah felt Edward tense beside her. There was something in the way he looked at the young woman named Soledad that made her uneasy. "Mrs. Thompson," Edward said slowly, "why are you all here?" Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her purse. "Edward, my boy, there is something I should have told you a long time ago. Something about Elizabeth." The mention of Edward's late wife made the air in the room thick. Sarah saw the color drain from his face. "What about Elizabeth?" His voice came out rougher than usual. Dr. Mendez gently interjected. "Mr. Sinclair, it might be better if we sit down. This is a conversation that requires delicacy." They settled into the main room, Sarah noticing how Soledad watched her with intense curiosity. The young woman had something in her posture that reminded Sarah of Edward, a natural elegance mixed with contained intensity. "Edward," Mrs. Thompson began, her hands nervously intertwined, "when Elizabeth died, you were so devastated that I decided not to tell you certain things. I thought it would be better to let you grieve in peace without additional complications." "What kind of complications?" Edward asked, but Sarah could see he was already bracing for the worst. Dr. Mendez opened a leather folder and pulled out several documents. "Mr. Sinclair, a few months before your wife passed away, she came to us with a delicate situation. Elizabeth had discovered that she had a half-sister. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward blinked several times, as if trying to process words that made no sense. "A half-sister? That's impossible." "Elizabeth was an only child." Carol Ruiz spoke for the first time, her voice soft yet firm. "Mr. Sinclair, I worked as a private nurse for Elizabeth's father during his last years. He was tormented by a secret he carried his whole life." "What secret?" Sarah asked, instinctively taking Edward's hand. "Before marrying Elizabeth's mother, he had a relationship with a young woman named Hope Ruiz, my older sister," Carol continued. "When she became pregnant, his family forced the breakup. Hope raised the child alone, in extreme poverty, and died when the child was only 15. Soledad finally spoke, her voice heavy with contained emotion. "That child was my mother, Hope Ruiz Jr. She passed away 2 years ago, but before she died, she told me the whole story. How she grew up knowing who her father was, but never had the courage to seek him out." Edward abruptly stood up, walking to the window. "Are you telling me that Elizabeth had a niece we never knew about?" "Not just that," Dr. Mendez said carefully. "Elizabeth discovered Soledad's existence a few months before the accident. She was planning to bring her to New York City, to officially include her in the family. She had even started the legal processes for recognition of kinship." Sarah watched Edward process this information, seeing the conflict of emotions pass over his face. Shock, confusion, pain at the mention of Elizabeth, and something that seemed like guilt. "Why didn't you tell me this when Elizabeth died?" he asked without turning around. "Because you could barely get out of bed," Mrs. Thompson replied, tears in her eyes. "Because adding more pain to your suffering seemed cruel. And because," she hesitated, "because Soledad was a minor and was well cared for by Carol. But now she is an adult," Carol added. "And with your new family situation," she looked kindly at Sarah, "Soledad felt it was time to formally introduce herself." Soledad stood up and approached Edward. "Mr. Sinclair." "Edward, I didn't come here expecting anything. I don't want money or legal recognition. I just wanted you to know that I exist, that Elizabeth found out about me, and that she wanted to meet me." Edward finally turned, and Sarah saw tears in his eyes. "You look so much like her," he whispered. "The eyes, the way you stand. Oh my God, you really are. Family of Elizabeth. I have pictures." Sophia said shyly, pulling an envelope from her bag. "Of my mother when she was young. Carol says she looked a lot like Elizabeth." Edward accepted the photos with trembling hands when he saw the first image. A young woman who could easily be Elizabeth's twin sister. His legs buckled, and he had to lean on the table. "Edward!" Sarah quickly stood up, concerned about his sudden paleness. "I'm fine," he murmured, but it was obvious he wasn't. It's like seeing Elizabeth young again." Dr. Anderson approached. "Mr. Thompson, there's one more thing." Elizabeth had left specific instructions about what to do if something happened to her before she could complete the recognition of Sophia. There is a trust fund, a part of the inheritance that she wanted to be allocated to her niece. "No," Sophia quickly interrupted. "I already said I didn't come for money." "But Elizabeth wanted," Edward said softly, still looking at the photos. "If Elizabeth wanted you to be part of the family, then you are part of the family." He raised his eyes to Sophia. "The question is, do you want to be?" Sarah observed the interaction between them, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was touched by the way Edward honored Elizabeth's memory. On the other, she couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, not of Sophia, but of the deep connection Edward still had with his first wife. "Edward!" Mrs. Thompson stood up. "There's a specific reason I brought Sophia today. With the baby coming, with you forming a new family, I thought it was important for Sophia to meet Sarah too." Sophia turned to Sarah with a hesitant smile. "Sarah, I hope you don't feel uncomfortable with all this. I know it must be strange to have an unknown relative of Elizabeth suddenly appearing." "It's not strange," Sarah replied, surprising herself with her own sincerity. "It's beautiful, actually, knowing that Elizabeth wanted to include you in the family, that she was thinking about the future." "And there's another thing," Dr. Anderson said, consulting his documents. Elizabeth had expressed the wish that should anything happen to her, Sophia should be considered as a potential guardian for any future child of Edward. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "Guardian?" Edward repeated slowly. "It was a hypothetical thought at the time," Dr. Anderson clarified quickly. "Elizabeth was not pregnant when she made these instructions, but she wanted to ensure that any child of the Thompson family would have connections to both sides of her family." Sarah instinctively placed a protective hand over her belly. The idea that a stranger, even a relative of Elizabeth, had some kind of claim over Michael made her deeply uncomfortable. "That doesn't apply to our current situation," Edward said firmly, noticing Sarah's reaction. "Michael will have Sarah as a mother and me as a father. Any other consideration is irrelevant." "Of course," Sophia said quickly. "I wasn't suggesting. Please don't misunderstand. I just wanted you to know about Elizabeth's wishes." Carol stood up, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "Maybe we should go. We've shared what we came to share." "No," Edward said suddenly. "Sophia, do you have somewhere to stay in New York City?" "I'm at the hotel downtown." "Nonsense. You are family. Rose can prepare one of the guest rooms." Edward looked at Sarah. If that doesn't bother Sarah. All eyes turned to her. Sarah knew that any objection would seem petty and possessive, but the truth was she wasn't ready to share Edward and his attention with anyone else, especially someone who represented such a deep connection to Elizabeth. "Of course," she forced a smile, "family is always welcome." But as Edward arranged accommodations for Sophia and Sarah went upstairs to rest, the day had been emotionally exhausting. She couldn't stop thinking about all the revelations. Ryan threatening to expose her charade, Edward proposing a royal marriage, and now Sophia, a living connection to Elizabeth that further complicated an already complex situation. Lying in her bed, Sarah placed her hands over her belly where Michael continued to move restlessly. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Are we getting into even bigger trouble?" Michael kicked hard, as if responding yes. Sarah closed her eyes, trying not to think about how her life had become so complicated in such a short time. When she woke up, she would have to make a decision about Edward's proposal. But now, with Sophia representing Edward's past and Ryan threatening her future, Sarah wasn't sure she knew what was real and what was performance. She only knew that she was falling more and more in love with a man whose heart might still belong to a dead woman. And that, more than any external threat, was what scared her the most. Sophia's presence in the mansion completely changed the dynamics of the house. Over the next 3 days, Sarah watched Edward show the young woman every room, every photo, every detail of the life he had shared with Elizabeth. There was a kindness in his attention that Sarah had never seen directed at anyone else, not even at her. This was Elizabeth's favorite music room, Edward explained as Sarah walked down the hallway, returning from yet another medical appointment. She played piano here every morning. My mother also played piano, Sophia replied softly. She said Elizabeth had promised to teach me when we met. Sarah quickened her pace, not wanting to hear more. Michael was becoming increasingly agitated. Inside her, his constant kicks reflecting the anxiety she was trying to hide from everyone. In the room, she found Rose tidying up her clothes with a worried expression. "Miss Sarah, may I speak frankly?" the housekeeper asked after closing the door. "Of course, Rose. What is it?" "Miss Adaptações, Soledad, Sophia, Rodrigo Silva, Ryan Smith, Dona Esperança, Mrs. Thompson, Gabriel, Michael, farsa, fingir, pretende, despejada, evicted, mansão Santa Marina, Thompson Mansion, Casa dos 50, 50s, Abala, Shaken, Histórias, Stories, Coração, Heart, Mãe, Mother, Casamento, Marriage, Casar, Marry, Família, Family, Sogra, Mother-in-law, Filho, Child, Filha, Daughter, Casamento, Marriage, Mãe, Mother, Pai, Father, Irmão, Brother, Irmã, Sister, Avó, Grandmother, Avô, Grandfather, Primo, Cousin, Prima, Cousin, Tio, Uncle, Tia, Aunt, Sobrinho, Nephew, Sobrinha, Niece, Namorado, Boyfriend, Namorada, Girlfriend, Amigo, Friend, Amiga, Friend, Escola, School, Universidade, University, Trabalho, Work, Carro, Car, Casa, House, Apartamento, Apartment, Rua, Street, Bairro, Neighborhood, Cidade, City, Estado, State, País, Country, Mundo, World, Vida, Life, Tempo, Time, Dia, Day, Noite, Night, Manhã, Morning, Tarde, Afternoon, Semana, Week, Mês, Month, Ano, Year, Minuto, Minute, Segundo, Second, Segundo, Second, Momento, Moment, Situação, Situation, Problema, Problem, Solução, Solution, Decisão, Decision, Opção, Option, Escolha, Choice, Caminho, Path, Direção, Direction, Destino, Destination, Sonho, Dream, Esperança, Hope, Amor, Love, Felicidade, Happiness, Tristeza, Sadness, Raiva, Anger, Medo, Fear, Surpresa, Surprise, Desespero, Despair, Confusão, Confusion, Dúvida, Doubt, Certeza, Certainty, Futuro, Future, Passado, Past, Presente, Present, História, History, Experiência, Experience, Memória, Memory, Pensamento, Thought, Ideia, Ideia, Conhecimento, Knowledge, Sabedoria e Wisdom, Inteligência, Intelligence, Compreensão, Understanding, Percepção, E percepção, opinião. Opinion, ponto de vista. Point of view, perspectiva. Perspective, visão. Vision, objetivo. Goal, meta. Target, sonho. Dream, desejo. Desire, necessidade. Need, vontade. Will, esforço. Effort, trabalho. Work, atividade. Activity, ação. Action, reação. Reaction, resultado. Result, consequência. Consequence, efeito. Effect, causa. Cause, motivo. Motive, razão. Reason, justificativa. Justification, explicação. Explanation, análise. Análises, avaliação. Evaluation, julgamento. Judgment, decisão. Decision, opção. Option, escolha. Choice, caminho. Path, direção. Direction, destino. Destination, sonho. Dream, esperança. Hope, amor. Love, felicidade. Happiness, tristeza. Sadness, raiva. Anger, medo. Moon fear, surpresa. Surprise, desespero. Despair, confusão. Confusion, dúvida. Doubt, certeza. Certainty, futuro. Future, passado. Past, presente. Present, história. History, experiência. Experience, memória. Memory, pensamento. Thought, ideia. Ideia, conhecimento. Knowledge, sabedoria. Wisdom, inteligência. Intelligence, compreensão. Understanding, percepção. Perception, opinião. Opinion, ponto de vista. Point of view, perspectiva. Perspective, visão. Vision, objetivo. Goal, meta. Target, sonho. Dream, desejo. Desire, necessidade. Need, vontade. Will, esforço. Effort, trabalho. Work, atividade. Activity, ação. Reaction and reason, reaction. Resultado, result e consequência. Consequência, efeito. Effect, causa de cause. Motivo, motive. Razão, reason. Justificativa, justification. Explicação, explanation. Análise, análises, avaliação, evaluation. Julgamento, judgment, decisão, decision. Opção, option, escolha, choice. Caminho, path, direção, direction. Destino, destinação, sonho, dream. Esperança, hope, amor, love. Felicidade, happiness, tristeza, sadness, raiva, anger, medo, fear. E surpresa, surprise, desespero, despair. Confusão, confusion, dúvida. Doubt, certeza, certainty. Futuro, future, passado, past. Presente, present, história, history. Experiência, experience. Memória, do memory. Pensamento, thought. Ideia, ideia. Conhecimento, knowledge. Sabedoria, de wisdom. Inteligência, intelligence. Compreensão, understanding. Percepção, perception. Opinião, opinion. Ponto de vista, point of view. Perspectiva, perspective. Visão, vision. Objetivo, goal. Meta, target. Sonho, dream. Desejo, desire. Necessidade, need. Vontade, will. Esforço, effort. Trabalho, work. Atividade, activity. Ação, action. Reação, reaction. Resultado, result e consequência. Consequência. Efeito, effect. Causa de cause. Motivo, motive. Razão, reason. justificativa, justification, explicação, explanation, análise, análises, avaliação, evaluation, julgamento, judgment, decisão, decision, opção, option, escolha, choice, caminho, path, direção, direction, destino, destinação, sonho, dream, esperança, hope, amor, love, felicidade, happiness, tristeza, sadness, raiva, anger, medo, fear, e surpresa, surprise, desespero, despair, confusão, confusão, dúvida, doubt, certeza, certainty, futuro, future, passado, past, present, present, história, history, experiência, experience, memória do memory, pensamento, thought, ideia, ideia, conhecimento, knowledge, sabedoria, wisdom, inteligência, intelligence, compreensão, understanding, percepção, perception, opinião, opinion, ponto de vista, point of view, perspectiva, perspective, visão, vision, objetivo, goal, meta, target, sonho, dream, desejo, desire, necessidade, need, vontade, will, esforço, effort, trabalho, work, atividade, activity, ação, action, reação, reaction, resultado, result e consequência, consequência, efeito, effect, causa de cause, motivo, motive, razão, reason, justificativa, justification, explicação, explanation, análise, análises, avaliação, evaluation, julgamento, judgment, decisão, decision, opção, option, escolha, choice, caminho, path, direção, direction, destino, destinação, sonho, dream, esperança, hope, amor, love, felicidade, happiness, tristeza, sadness, raiva, anger, medo, fear, e surpresa, surprise, desespero, despair, confusão, confusão, dúvida, doubt, certeza, certainty, futuro, future, passado, past, present, present, história, history, experiência, experience, memória do memory, pensamento, thought, ideia, ideia, conhecimento, knowledge, sabedoria, wisdom, inteligência, intelligence, compreensão, understanding, percepção, perception, opinião, opinion, ponto de vista, point of view, perspectiva, perspective, visão, vision, objetivo, goal, meta, target, sonho, dream, desejo, desire, necessidade, need, vontade, will, esforço, effort, trabalho, work, atividade, activity, ação, action, reação, reaction, resultado, result e consequência, consequência, efeito, effect, causa de cause, motivo, motive, razão, reason, justificativa, justification, explicação, explanation, análise, análises, avaliação, evaluation, julgamento, judgment, decisão, decision, opção, option, escolha, choice, caminho, path, direção, direction, destino, destinação, sonho, dream, esperança, hope, amor, love, felicidade, happiness, tristeza, sadness, raiva, anger, medo, fear, e surpresa, surprise, desespero, despair, confusão, confusão, dúvida, doubt, certeza, certainty. Futuro, future, passado, past. Presente, present, história, history. Experiência, ou experience. Memória, do memory. Pensamento, thought. Ideia, ideia. Conhecimento, knowledge. Sabedoria, wisdom. Inteligência, intelligence. Compreensão, understanding. Percepção, perception. Opinião, opinion. Ponto de vista, point of view. Perspectiva, perspective. Visão, vision. Objetivo, goal. Meta, target. Sonho, dream. Desejo, desire. Necessidade, need. Vontade, will. Esforço, effort. Trabalho, work. Atividade, activity. Ação, action. Reação, reaction. Resultado, result e consequência, consequência. Efeito, effect. Causa, de cause. Motivo, motive. Razão, reason. Justificativa, justification. Explicação, explanation. Análise, análises, avaliação, evaluation. Julgamento, judgment, decisão, decision. Opção, option, escolha, choice. Caminho, path, direção, direction. Destino, destinação, sonho, dream. Esperança, hope, amor, love. Felicidade, happiness. Tristeza, sadness. Raiva, anger, medo, fear. E surpresa, ou surprise, desespero, despair. Confusão, confusão, dúvida, doubt. Certeza, certainty. Futuro, future, passado, past. Presente, present, história, history. Experiência, ou experience. Memória, do memory. Pensamento, thought. Ideia, ideia. Conhecimento, knowledge. Sabedoria, wisdom. Inteligência, intelligence. Compreensão, understanding. Percepção, perception. Opinião, opinion. Ponto de vista, point of view. Perspectiva, perspective. Visão, vision. Objetivo, goal. Meta, target. Sonho, dream. Desejo, desire. Necessidade, need. Vontade, will. Esforço, effort. Trabalho, work. Atividade, activity. Ação, action. Reação, reaction. Resultado, result e consequência, consequência. Efeito, effect. Causa, de cause. Motivo, motive. Razão, reason. Justificativa, justification. Explicação, explanation. Analise. For the first time since Sarah had met her, the Spanish matriarch seemed fragile and old. "Is it true?" she asked in a broken voice. "Was it all a lie?" The silence that followed was deafening. Edward opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah began, but the older woman raised her hand. "I need to know the truth. Did you marry for love or for money?" Sarah looked at Edward, seeing the same conflict she felt reflected in his eyes. The truth was complicated. It had started for money, but it had become something more. But how to explain that to a woman who had opened her heart based on a lie? "It started as a deal," Sarah finally said, deciding that Mrs. Thompson deserved honesty. Edward needed a temporary wife to convince her that he was moving on. "I needed money to take care of the baby." Tears began to roll down Mrs. Thompson's face. "And now?" "What is it now?" Edward approached his mother-in-law, his own eyes misty. "Now it's love, Grandma. Real, complicated, but genuine. How can I believe in you after so many lies?" The question echoed in the room, and Sarah realized there was no easy answer. How to rebuild trust after such a fundamental betrayal? "You can't," Sarah said softly, struggling to stand. "And you have every right not to trust." "Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry." "You didn't deserve to be deceived." Sarah began to walk toward the stairs, but Sophia's voice stopped her. "Sarah, wait!" She turned to find the young woman looking at her with a thoughtful expression. "Can I ask a question?" "A question about Edward?" Sarah nodded, too tired to care about what was coming. "Do you believe he loves you?" Genuinely. The question caught Sarah off guard. Yes, I believe he does." "And do you love him?" "Yes." Sophia nodded slowly. "Then maybe the problem isn't that it started as a lie. Maybe the problem is that you're letting other people define what is real for you." Sarah looked at Edward, who was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sophia said calmly, "that Elizabeth once told me that true love doesn't apologize for existing. It doesn't matter how it started. It doesn't matter what others think. If it's real now, that's all that matters." Mrs. Thompson looked at Sophia in surprise. "Elizabeth told you that?" "Yes, when she was telling me about how she met Edward. She said it didn't matter that others thought she was too young, or that he was too wealthy. What mattered was that they loved each other." Sarah felt Michael kick hard, as if the baby was reacting to the emotion in the air. "What I'm trying to say," Sophia continued, "is that maybe it's time to stop hiding behind deals and justifications. If you love each other, if you want to build a family together, then fight for it. Don't let Ryan Smith or anyone else decide what is real in your relationship." Edward stepped closer to Sarah, carefully taking her hands. "Sophia is right," he said softly. "Sarah, I love you. I love Michael. And if you accept me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that every day. Even with all this scandal. Even with Ryan threatening custody. Even with your reputation being publicly destroyed. Especially because of all that," Edward replied firmly. "Because now everyone will know that we chose to be together not out of obligation or convenience, but out of love." Sarah looked at Mrs. Thompson, who was watching the interaction with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, can you forgive us?" But the matriarch was silent for a long moment, then stepped forward and hugged Sarah tightly. "My girl," she whispered, "love forgives all. And if you truly love each other, then you have my blessing." Sarah finally allowed the tears to fall, feeling for the first time in days that there might be hope. "So," Edward said, kneeling in front of her again, "Sarah Johnson, will you accept to be my wife? For real this time, to face whatever comes, as a real family?" Sarah looked around the room, at Mrs. Thompson smiling through tears, at Sophia nodding encouragingly, at Edward waiting for her answer with total vulnerability in his eyes. Michael kicked one last time, strong and determined. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice firm and clear. "I accept." But even while Edward kissed her and Mrs. Thompson applauded, Sarah knew that accepting was just the first step. Now they would have to prove, to the world, to Ryan, to themselves, that love built on lies could still become the most solid truth of their lives. The battle had only just begun. The next 15 days were a whirlwind of lawyers, journalists, and legal strategies. The Thompson mansion transformed into a bunker where a team of 5 lawyers worked day and night to protect Edward, Sarah, and Michael's future. The civil wedding was scheduled for the following Friday, an intimate ceremony that would serve both as a declaration of love and as a legal strategy. Sarah was in Edward's office, watching Dr. William Carter, the best family lawyer in New York City, explain the gravity of the situation. The 60-year-old man, with graying hair and gold-framed glasses, did not sugarcoat his words. "The situation is delicate, Mrs. Johnson," he said, flipping through documents spread across the table. "Ryan Smith has elements for a strong custody case, proven biological paternity, evidence that your relationship started as a farce, and now media exposure that could be interpreted as an unstable environment for a child." Edward, who had been pacing nervously around the room, stopped abruptly. "But we have counterpoints, right?" "Yes, his initial abandonment during the pregnancy, the attempted blackmail, which fortunately we recorded, and the fact that he only expressed interest in paternity after discovering the Thompson estate." Dr. Carter adjusted his glasses. "But Sarah, being direct, being pregnant and in the midst of a public scandal is not ideal." Sarah instinctively placed her hands on her belly, where Michael seemed restless. At 8 months pregnant, every strong emotion triggered Braxton Hicks contractions that left her breathless. "There's one more complication," Dr. Carter continued, hesitating. "Ryan Smith is not acting alone. He has financial backing." "What do you mean?" Edward asked, his voice tense. "We investigated his finances. Ryan is a mediocre lawyer with significant debts. He wouldn't have the resources to hire the legal team he's using, nor to run such elaborate media campaigns." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Someone is financing him?" "Exactly. And based on the tracked payments." Dr. Carter paused dramatically. "The money comes from accounts linked to Robert Anderson." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward leaned heavily on the table, his face pale. "Robert is using Ryan to destroy me," he murmured. "It's not just about custody of Michael. It's about forcing a situation where I lose all credibility and am forced to sell my share of the company." "That makes sense," Dr. Carter confirmed. "If you lose custody of Michael, or if Sarah is deemed an unstable influence, your position as a responsible family man is compromised. Mrs. Thompson could withdraw support. Shareholders would question your leadership." Sarah abruptly stood up, a strong contraction making her grip the chair. "So Michael is not just my son to Ryan. He's a pawn in Robert's corporate war." Edward immediately moved closer to support her. "Sarah, are you okay?" "I'm furious," she replied, but her breathing was quickening. "I'm furious because powerful men are playing with my son's life as if he were property." Another contraction, stronger than the last, made Sarah bend slightly. Edward held her firmly. "Dr. Carter, we'll have to continue this later," Edward said, clear concern in his voice. "Sarah, I need to take you to the doctor." "No, I'm fine. It's just false contractions." But as she spoke, Sarah felt a warm liquid trickle down her legs. The silence in the room was absolute as everyone processed what was happening. "The water broke," Sarah whispered, looking at Edward with wide eyes. "Edward, my water broke." The next hours passed in a blur of sirens, doctors, and hospital corridors. Sarah was admitted immediately to Mount Sinai Hospital, where Dr. Carter examined her with a worried expression. "Sarah, you're 36 weeks along. It's considered premature, but it's not critical," he explained as he adjusted the monitors tracking Michael's heartbeat. "But labor has already started, so we'll have to proceed." In the delivery room, Edward held Sarah's hand, wearing hospital scrubs that made him look vulnerable and human in a way she had never seen. "You can do this," he whispered between contractions. "Michael is waiting to meet the bravest mother in the world." "Edward," Sarah gasped during a particularly intense contraction, "if something happens to me, nothing is going to happen." "But if it does," she insisted, gripping his hand with desperate strength, "promise you won't let Ryan take Michael. Promise you'll fight for him as if he were your own son." Edward kissed her sweaty forehead. "Sarah, Michael is my son, in every way that matters, and I will protect him with my life if necessary." 2 hours later, at 11:47 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday, Michael Thompson was born, weighing 2.8 kilograms and measuring 47 centimeters. His first cry filled the delivery room, and Sarah felt as if her heart would explode with love and relief. "He's perfect," Dr. Carter announced, placing Michael in Sarah's arms. "A completely healthy baby." Sarah looked at her son's red, wrinkled face, seeing traces of herself in the shape of his eyes and something indefinable that made her think of Edward in the curve of his chin. Michael opened his eyes, dark brown like his father's, and seemed to look directly at her. "Hi, my love," she whispered, tears streaming freely. "I can finally meet you." Edward stepped closer, and Sarah saw that he was also crying. "Can I?" he asked reverently. Sarah carefully passed Michael to Edward's arms, watching how he held the baby with a tenderness that contrasted with his physical strength. "Michael," Edward murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "Welcome to the family, son." The word son echoed in the room, and Sarah realized there was nothing false or rehearsed about that moment. Edward looked at Michael with the pure, unconditional love of a true father. Mrs. Thompson arrived at the hospital 2 hours later, followed by Sophia and a procession of flowers, that transformed Sarah's room into a garden. The matriarch held Michael with tears in her eyes, murmuring prayers in Spanish and declaring that he was a perfect angel. But the peace was interrupted the next morning when Dr. Carter appeared with disturbing news. Ryan filed an emergency petition, he announced bluntly. He's claiming that the premature birth was caused by stress due to an unstable environment, and he's asking for immediate temporary custody. Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Can he do that? Technically, yes. And there's more. Dr. Carter hesitated. Robert Anderson is using his political influence. He managed to get the case assigned to Judge Michael Thompson, who is known for, let's say, traditional views on family structure. Edward positioned himself protectively between Michael's crib and the door. No one is taking my son from this family. Edward, legally Michael is still not your son. You haven't married yet, you haven't adopted him. Dr. Carter paused significantly. But there's something we can do. It's risky, but it could resolve everything at once. What? Sarah asked. Provoke Robert to show his cards. If we can prove that he is behind with all of this, which is manipulating Ryan to destroy Edward in business, the whole situation changes. Sarah looked at Michael, sleeping peacefully in the crib next to her bed. Her son was only 2 days old and was already at the center of a war that could define the rest of his life. How do we do this? She asked, her voice firm despite the fear. Dr. Carter smiled for the first time since she had met him. With the help of someone that Robert doesn't see as a threat. At that moment, Sophia entered the room carrying coffee for everyone. Dr. Carter watched her thoughtfully. Miss Sophia, you mentioned that you work in investigative journalism, correct? Yes, in Barcelona. Why? Because, Dr. Carter said, it might be time to make Robert Anderson realize that he has severely underestimated the family he is trying to destroy. Sarah looked at Edward, then at Michael, and finally at Sophia. Throughout her life, she had relied only on herself. But now, looking at the people around her, chosen family, Hart family, she realized she had never been so strong. What do we need to do? She asked. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah Johnson felt ready for war. Michael woke up at that moment as if he could sense his mother's determination, and his strong, healthy cry echoed through the room like a battle cry. The fight for the future of the Thompson family was just beginning. The plan that Dr. Carter had devised was risky, but ingenious. 3 days after Michael's birth, Sarah was back at the mansion with the baby, officially recovering from childbirth, but secretly coordinating an operation that could either save or definitively destroy her family. Sophia had used her contacts in investigative journalism to uncover crucial information about Robert Anderson. Sitting in the living room, with Michael sleeping in her arms, Sarah listened to the shocking revelations that the young woman had discovered. Robert isn't just trying to buy Edward's share in the company, Sophia explained, consulting her notes. He has massive debts with Chinese investors. If he doesn't gain control of Thompson Textiles in the next 2 months, he will lose everything. Edward, who had cancelled all meetings to stay home with Sarah and Michael, leaned forward in his chair. That explains his desperation. But how does this help us? Because, Dr. Carter intervened, desperate men make mistakes, and we are going to give Robert an irresistible opportunity to make the biggest mistake of his life. The lawyer opened a folder and spread documents across the coffee table. Sarah, you are going to pretend that you want to make a deal with Ryan. You will contact him saying that you are tired of the public exposure and willing to negotiate. Sarah frowned. But isn't that risky? What if he actually gains some kind of legal advantage? He won't, because everything will be recorded and documented. But here is the most important part. Dr. Carter smiled with satisfaction. Sophia will be at the meeting as a journalist, pretending to do a piece on single mothers in custody disputes. Robert and Ryan won't suspect a thing. Mrs. Thompson, who had arrived for her daily visit to Michael, held the baby with the affection of a true grandmother. Is this safe? Is there no danger for the baby? On the contrary, Grandma, Edward replied. If it works, Michael will be protected forever. The meeting was set for the restaurant at the Copacabana Palace Hotel, a public and elegant location where Robert Anderson felt comfortable doing business. Sarah arrived wearing a navy blue suit that made her look professional but fragile from recent motherhood. Exactly the image they wanted to project. Ryan was already at the table when she arrived, accompanied by Robert, who introduced himself as a consultant in the situation. Sophia was a few tables ahead, discreetly filming with professional equipment, supposedly interviewing other mothers for her piece. "Zara," Ryan stood up to greet her, trying to appear charming. "You look beautiful. Motherhood suits you." "Thank you," she replied coldly, sitting down. "Let's get straight to the point, Ryan. What do you want?" Robert leaned forward, taking control of the conversation. "Mrs. Thompson, let's be realistic. This whole situation is harming everyone involved. Michael deserves to grow up in a stable environment, away from scandals and public disputes." "And you believe that environment would be with Ryan?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Michael needs his biological father," Ryan insisted. "And honestly, Sarah, you can provide him with financial stability now. But what happens when Thompson gets tired of playing family? You'll be left with nothing." Sarah pretended to consider the words, while secretly wondering how she had become romantically involved with such a manipulative man. "What are you proposing?" she asked. Robert smiled, thinking he had gained ground. "Shared custody, with Ryan having decision-making rights over education and important medical issues. In exchange, we drop all public accusations about your arrangement with Thompson, and financially, Ryan is prepared to offer a generous alimony," Robert said, but Sarah noticed he didn't specify amounts. "How generous?" Robert and Ryan exchanged glances. $5,000 a month, Ryan finally said. Sarah almost laughed. Edward spent more than that just on clothes for Michael. "And what about the Thompson Company?" she asked casually. "I imagine this whole situation isn't good for Edward's business." Robert leaned in even further, clearly thinking he was about to close the deal. "Between us, Sarah Thompson is facing serious difficulties. Negative exposure, loss of investor confidence. He may not be able to maintain his current lifestyle for much longer." "You seem very informed about his finances," Sarah observed. "Business is my interest," Robert replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And I can say it would be wise for you to secure your financial independence before the situation with Thompson worsens." Sarah pretended to hesitate. "I need to think." "Sarah?" Ryan leaned in closer, lowering his voice, in a conspiratorial voice. "There's one more thing you should know. Robert has enough influence to ensure that if this case goes to trial, you'll have much bigger problems than losing Michael." "What kind of problems?" Robert looked around to make sure no one was listening, a futile precaution since Sophia was recording everything. "Investigations into tax evasion, questions about the source of the money that Thompson paid you, possible accusations of prostitution." He let the threats hang in the air. Sarah felt genuine anger rise in her throat, but kept her expression neutral. "Are you threatening me?" "We're offering you an exit," Ryan corrected. "A chance for Michael to grow up away from all this confusion. And all I have to do is abandon Edward and hand my son over to you. Joint custody," Robert emphasized. "And the assurance that your life won't be destroyed by unnecessary legal complications." Sarah slowly stood up. "I need time to think about your proposal." "Of course," Robert smiled, clearly satisfied. "But don't take too long. Some opportunities have an expiration date." 2 hours later, Sarah was back at the mansion, where Edward, Dr. Carter, and Sophia were anxiously waiting. "We did it," Sophia announced triumphantly, showing her camera. "Everything recorded in high definition." Robert admitted he's behind the legal threats, confirmed he has influence to manipulate the judicial system, and even made direct threats of blackmail. Dr. Carter studied the recordings with growing satisfaction. "This is more than enough to take down Robert Anderson. Manipulating the judicial system, blackmail, threats. He just dug his own grave." Edward carefully embraced Sarah. "You were incredibly brave. But how did you feel hearing Ryan talk about Michael that way?" "Disgusted," Sarah admitted. but also absolutely certain that we made the right decision. Edward, Michael is your son, in every way that matters. Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway carrying Michael, who had woken up from his nap. Did everything go well? Better than we expected, Grandma, Edward replied, taking Michael in his arms. Robert just gave us all the ammunition we needed. Dr. Carter closed his briefcase with a sense of mission accomplished. Tomorrow morning, I'll deliver all this to the district attorney's office. Robert Anderson will have much bigger problems to worry about than textile companies. That night, Sarah was in Michael's room, watching him sleep in his crib when Edward appeared in the doorway. Can't sleep? He asked softly. Still processing everything, she admitted. 6 months ago, I was about to be evicted, pregnant and abandoned. Now you are Sarah Thompson, mother of Michael Thompson, and the bravest woman I've ever known. Edward stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her. And tomorrow, when Robert realizes he underestimated our family, he'll understand that messing with the Thompsons was the biggest mistake of his life. Sarah leaned against Edward, feeling safe for the first time in months. And Ryan will find out that blackmail and threats have serious legal consequences. Dr. Carter is already preparing the charges. Michael stirred in his sleep, making little sounds that made them smile. Do you think he'll remember all this when he grows up? Sarah asked. I hope he only remembers that he was loved from the very first moment. Edward kissed her hair. And that he had parents who fought for him with everything they had. Parents, Sarah repeated the word, enjoying how it sounded. Edward, when all this is over, when we're officially married and Michael is safe, what do we do next? Edward smiled, looking at Michael, who was sleeping peacefully. Next we live, Sarah. We raise Michael, build our family, and prove that some of the best love stories start in the most unlikely places. At that moment, Michael opened his eyes and looked directly at them, as if agreeing with his parents' plans. For the first time since she had accepted the original agreement with Edward, Sarah truly believed she had a happy future ahead. But first, Robert Anderson needed to realize he had chosen the wrong family to destroy. And that realization would come the next morning, changing everything forever. The following morning brought a twist that no one had anticipated. Sarah woke up to Michael crying and found Edward in the office, speaking on the phone with a serious expression that immediately made her anxious. I understand. Yes, doctor, we'll be there in an hour. He hung up and turned to Sarah with a mix of anger and satisfaction in his eyes. What happened? She asked, adjusting Michael, who had stopped crying upon seeing Edward. Robert Anderson was arrested 2 hours ago, Edward announced. Charges of corruption, blackmail, judicial manipulation, and money laundering. Apparently our recording was just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah felt her legs weaken. Arrested. The FBI had been investigating him for months over corruption schemes involving government contracts. Our evidence gave the investigators exactly what they needed to close in. Edward stepped closer, extending his arms to take Michael. And there's more. Ryan is trying to make a plea deal. A deal? He wants to turn over all the details of Robert's scheme in exchange for immunity, including publicly admitting he was paid to try to destroy us. Edward smiled, but there was something predatory in his expression. Dr. Carter says that when this hits the media, Ryan will be so compromised that any custody case becomes impossible. Sarah sat heavily in the chair, trying to process how quickly everything had changed. So, is it over? Not completely. We still need to deal with the legal and media fallout. But Sarah... Edward knelt in front of her, Michael still in his arms. Michael is safe. Our family is safe. Tears of relief began to stream down Sarah's face. In the past weeks, she had lived in constant fear of losing her son, of seeing Edward destroyed, of having her entire life publicly crumble. Now, for the first time she could breathe. There's one more thing, Edward said softly. Dr. Carter managed to expedite our marriage process. We can get married today if you want. Officially, legally, no more waiting. Sarah looked at Edward holding Michael, their son, who had become theirs through extraordinary circumstances, and felt her heart overflow with love. "Yes," she said firmly, "I want to marry you today." The civil ceremony took place at 3 in the afternoon at the most elegant registry office in New York City, with Mrs. Thompson as the matron of honor and Sophia as the witness. Sarah wore a simple yet elegant cream dress that Edward had chosen, and he donned his best navy suit. Michael slept peacefully in Mrs. Thompson's arms throughout the ceremony. "Edward Thompson, do you take Sarah Johnson as your lawful wedded wife? To love and cherish her in joy and sorrow, in health and sickness, in wealth and poverty, until death do you part?" The judge asked solemnly. "I do," Edward replied, looking directly into Sarah's eyes with an intensity that made her heart race. "Sarah Johnson, do you take Edward Thompson as your lawful wedded husband, to love and cherish him in joy and sorrow, in health and sickness, in wealth and poverty, until death do you part?" Sarah thought of the entire journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate agreement, the lies that became truths, the threats they faced together, and the love that had grown amidst the chaos. "I do," she said, her voice clear and determined. When Edward kissed her to seal the marriage, Sarah felt as if she were finally coming home after a long and perilous journey. The reception was intimate, just family at the Thompson mansion. Mrs. Thompson had insisted on preparing a special risotto, and the aroma of saffron and seafood filled the house with a joy that had long been absent. "Finally!" Mrs. Thompson exclaimed during the toast, holding a champagne glass while gently rocking Michael. A real family, built with love and courage. Sophia approached Sarah during the small but warm celebration. "Sarah, can I talk to you for a moment?" They stepped away to the balcony, where the garden lights created a magical atmosphere. "I want to apologize," Sophia said unexpectedly. "Apologize? Why?" "Because when I arrived here, I was so focused on honoring Elizabeth's memory that I didn't realize how my presence might be complicating things for you." Sophia looked at the party through the window, where Edward was animatedly chatting with Dr. Carter. Elizabeth was special, and she will always be a part of Edward's life. But seeing you two together, seeing how he looks at you and Michael, Sophia, let me finish, she smiled. What I want to say is that Elizabeth would have loved you. She would have loved to see Edward happy again, would have loved Michael as if he were her own grandson. And I love you too. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. That means a lot to me. And there's one more thing. I've decided to stay in the US for a longer time. Edward offered me a job at the company, helping with international expansion. I hope you don't mind having a sister-in-law around. Sophia laughed. Sister-in-law? Sarah repeated, enjoying how the word sounded. I think Michael will love having an aunt. Later that night, when everyone had left and the house was finally quiet, Sarah and Edward found themselves in the room they now officially shared. Michael slept in his crib beside the bed, breathing softly. How do you feel, Mrs. Thompson? Edward asked, hugging her from behind as she watched Michael sleep. Still surreal, Sarah admitted, leaning against him. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I would be married to Edward Thompson with a healthy son and a family that loves me, you would have thought it was crazy. I would have thought it was a fairy tale, she corrected. And I stopped believing in fairy tales when my parents died. Edward turned her in his arms so they could look at each other. And now? Sarah looked around the room, at Michael sleeping peacefully, at the family photos Edward had placed on the nightstand, including a beautiful picture of the 3 of them in the hospital. At the architectural plans for the new playground Edward wanted to build in the garden for when Michael was older. Now I believe that sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it, she said softly. Edward, can I tell you a secret? Always. When I accepted your original agreement, I was so desperate that I would have agreed to almost anything. But deep down, a very small part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, something real could grow from it. And did it grow? Sarah smiled, thinking of all they had faced together. A family grew. True love grew. A life grew that I never dared to dream. Edward kissed her gently. Sarah, I promise I will spend the rest of my life giving you reasons to keep believing in fairy tales." Michael chose that moment to wake up and make a little sound that made them smile. Edward approached the crib and picked up his son in his arms. "And you, little Michael, will grow up knowing that sometimes the best stories begin in the most unlikely places," he whispered to the baby, who looked at him with alert and curious eyes. Sarah watched Edward with Michael, remembering how he had held their son for the first time in the hospital, with reverence, love, and a total commitment that had sealed their fate. "Edward," she said softly, "thank you for making our farce the most beautiful truth of my life." Edward smiled, adjusting Michael more comfortably in his arms. "Thank you for teaching me that true love can grow in any soil, as long as it is watered with courage and honesty." Outside, New York City continued its bustling nightlife, oblivious to the fact. In the Thompson mansion, a family had been forged through extraordinary circumstances, sealed by genuine love and protected by a fierce determination to fight for happiness. Michael yawned and closed his eyes, confident in the arms of the father who had chosen him and beside the mother who had fought for him since before he was born. And Sarah Johnson, who had begun that journey as a desperate woman accepting an impossible deal, now lay beside the husband she loved, listening to the gentle breath of the son who was finally safe, knowing that she had found not only a happy ending, but a true beginning. 6 months had been enough to transform a necessary lie into the most solid truth of their lives. And the future, for the first time in a long time, shone with infinite possibilities.